Hi everybody, very welcome to Mentour and yet another video podcast. As always, I hope you're doing absolutely fantastic. Today on the video, guys, I'm going to start something brand new. I'm going to start a series where I look into some famous and not so famous incidents and accidents, and I'll give you my view of what happens inside of the cockpit and why that happened. And we're going to start with the infamous Smartwings 1125 that happened almost a year ago now, where a 737 crew had an engine failure en route, and instead of diverting and landing as soon as possible, they decided to continue the flight for more than 2 hours across Europe. Why did that happen, and what did the final report say? Stay tuned.
Wind 31016, everyone right, right on. Third one in, 31 right. Delta 260, just produced.
Alright guys, so before I start, I want to say a huge thank you to my Patreon crew and all of my patrons who helped me translate this final report from Czech, because it's only available in Czech, into English. And because of that translation, and because Czech doesn't really translate exactly into English in some cases, there are some stuff in here that might not be exactly as written in the report. So if you're a Czech and you are reading through the report, there might be some small differences. But all in all, a fantastic job by my Patreon crew. Okay, thank you very much, guys. So this flight, guys, is interesting from a lot of different perspectives. And what I want to try to do in this series is to give my perspective and the perspective of a training captain on what went on. And I have to say that I have read a lot of final reports in my life, but I've never read a final report who has been such an unequivocal rebuke of someone's performance, as in it is an absolute takedown of one of the pilots in this crew. But let's start from the beginning to tell you about what happened. So this is a Smartwings 737-800 that flew from the island of Samos in Greece to Prague. Okay, it happened on the 22nd of August last year, 2019, and the crew consisted of a very senior captain. He was either a chief pilot or head of operation, depending on what the translation says, of Smartwings, so high up in the management, and a fairly senior first officer. The first officer had more than 3,000 hours in total and over 2,000 hours on type, so it's a very senior crew. The aircraft had had some previous problems with engine number one, that's on the left-hand side of the aircraft, and but the engineering had, done what was needed, and it had been released for service. So it was perfectly serviceable for this flight. The crew noticed during the pushback and engine start that the engine started a little bit slower. The engine number one started a bit slower than engine number two. However, they thought that this had to do with the wind conditions on the airport, and this is true. Sometimes when you push back an aircraft and, for example, you turn into tailwind, in that case the wind that's blowing from the back can actually slow down the engine start a bit. So this is not uncommon. It's not something that I would have noticed or thought about. They taxied out, they took off normally. The first officer was pilot flying and the captain was pilot monitoring. And the captain noticed during the takeoff roll that the thrust setting on the engine number one was about 1.5% lower N1 than on the right side. He said in the report that he thought that this was negligible. However, there is a specific briefing for Samos, because Samos is a very performance limited runway, saying that you have to make sure that you have proper N1 set during takeoff from this airport in any occasion. Anyway, the aircraft took off normally. It climbed up. Climbed to flight level 360. It has had a weight of about 64 tons when it reached flight level 360. And almost immediately once they had reached their cruising level, engine number one started spooling back and eventually failed. Now, I have done a video on what happens if an engine fails while you're in cruise, and you can check out. There's going to be a link here and a link down in the description of the video. But basically what you need to understand is that a 737 or any commercial aircraft is built to fly up to a really high level. So in the case of the 737-800, we can cruise at 41,000 feet if we're light enough, but only if we have two working engines. if one engine fails, we don't have enough thrust to maintain both speed and altitude. And the single engine service ceiling of a 737-800, which is the altitude that you can keep on one engine, tends to vary between about 23 to 25,000 feet depending on the weight. So it is crucial, if an engine fails at that altitude, that you very quickly monitor, decide which engine is faulty, fly the aircraft first, and then initiate what we call a drift down procedure, which is basically a way to start descending the aircraft down to below its single engine service ceiling. The first officer who was pilot flying very quickly realized the engine failure, applied the correct amount of rudder to keep the aircraft flying, and then started to try to communicate with the captain. He said several times that they needed to reduce altitude, that they needed to descend. However, there was no response back from the captain. All right. In the report, the captain is blaming problems with his headset. However, that doesn't seem to have been the case later on during the flight. So it's hard to say why the captain didn't respond here. But for a full 2 minutes, the aircraft was cruising along on one engine at 36,000 feet, which meant that the speed crept down to about 226 knots of indicated airspeed. Now, this is still a safe airspeed, but you couldn't go much lower than that without starting to get into the caution amber band of the airspeed at that altitude. After about 2 minutes, the first officer managed to convince the captain to initiate the descent. However, they did not declare a pan-pan. Now, if you have an engine failure, all right, if you were in what we call reduced vertical separation minima airspace, RVSM airspace, it is mandatory to call a minimum of a pan-pan, which is an urgency call, to let the air traffic control know that you're not able to maintain altitude and thus be able to clear all traffic below you. Right, it's very, very important. So either you declare a pan-pan, which is an urgency call, or a mayday, which is an emergency call. The difference is that a pan-pan means that you need to do something quickly, but there's no immediate danger to the aircraft, while a mayday call means that there's a risk of immediate danger for the aircraft or people on board. But none of this was called. Right? Instead, the crew reported a maintenance issue and requested to descend to flight level 240, 24,000 feet. This also meant that they did not turn off the airway. They started descending without clearance to 24,000 feet, and they maintained the airway. This is important for a couple of different reasons. If you have an emergency descent because of pressurization, for example, or if you have to descend because of an engine failure, then because of the way that the airways are structured and the fact that you might have traffic just below you on the same airway with only 1,000 feet of difference in altitude, it's really important that if you start descending without having a clearance to do so, that you turn either off 45 degrees, which is what we normally do, or you do a paralleling of the track, as in you turn out and you parallel the airway with maybe 2 miles difference. That way you won't be descending into ongoing or paralleling traffic. Okay, this was not done. They descended down eventually. They got the clearance to do so as they talked to air traffic control down to 24,000 feet. Now, during the descent, the pilot monitoring is the one that's handling the quick reference handbook, the checklists. And he started doing the in-flight restart checklist. Okay. Now, the in-flight restart checklist you can do in 2 different ways. Either you can do a windmilling start, which is basically you're using the airspeed, and the airspeed is blowing so much air through the engine that the engine is rotating enough to keep it starting. Or you can do a cross-bleed restart. They elected to start by trying to use the windmilling start, so they increased the airspeed to 310 knots. And they tried to restart it. It didn't work. And then almost immediately they tried a cross-bleed restart, which also failed. So at this point they've tried to restart the engine twice. It didn't work. And at that point you can be pretty sure that there's something severely wrong with this engine. That's why it's not starting. Then the pilot monitoring, the captain, started going through the engine failure and shutdown non-normal checklists. All right. It was stated in the report that he did it in a really quick manner. So quick that the first officers had problems following the items being done. But one thing that is very, very clear in that checklist is once you have gone through it, once you've set up the aircraft properly for the engine failure, it says at the very last point that you have to land at the nearest suitable airport. Plan to land at the nearest suitable airport. Okay. So what is the nearest suitable airport then? Well, when you do your type rating on the 737, you have to read through something called the Flight Crew Training Manual. This is a manual that is generic, made by Boeing test pilot, which is stating the best way of handling different scenarios from their perspective. And it outlines very clearly what they mean by the nearest suitable airport. The same thing is also done in the QRH, in the beginning of the QRH, where it's stated how to read the checklist. And basically it says that the nearest suitable airport is the nearest airport that is still safe to land at. So you have to take into account, for example, NOTAMs, if there's something going on, if the runway is closed, for example, or if the runway is shorter than normal. You have to look at the weather, if the weather is within operating minimas, and if that's the case, well then it's a suitable airport. There's nothing in there about, for example, operational support or if it's economically viable for the airline or anything like that. It's just a safety kind of consideration in here. So when they came to that point, the captain quite quickly decided that they should be continuing towards Prague. Okay. They were looking at different en route alternates. For example, they had Thessaloniki. They decided, that's not explained in the report why they decided that wasn't suitable. They had Budapest, but they also had Vienna, which is a big commercial airport just on their route. The captain decided that that wasn't suitable because of traffic reasons. Now it should be said that if you declare a mayday or a pan-pan call, you have priority. So traffic is not really an issue. You will always get the priority in to land at an airport like Vienna, for example, if you're coming in with an engine failure. There's no question about that. And the captain knows this. All right. Now instead he decided to continue towards Prague, which was a full 2 hours and I think 11 minutes away. Okay, and this is after the engine failure. The first officer was not happy with this, not at all. He tried several times to highlight the plan to land at the nearest suitable airport point in the QRH, but after a few times where the captain was dismissive of this, he basically decided that in the name of crew resource management and keeping the cockpits kind of feeling better, he decided to go with the piloting command's decision, which the piloting command is the one that has the last word in this. However, in this case, it was obviously a very, very strange decision to make. Okay, but on top of this, they still have not issued a pan-pan or mayday. So air traffic control has no idea that they have an engine failure. They just know that they have some kind of maintenance issue and they want to go down to 24,000 feet. That could be anything. It could be a pack not working, so that they want to go down there in order to to help the pressurization, for example. So they continue to fly. Now, if you're going to go and fly for over 2 hours, there is, when we calculate what we call a takeoff alternate, there is a rule that states that you need to have a takeoff alternate within 1 hour of single engine flying time, and that's 396 nautical miles, because that's what they're counting on. Now, there is a possibility that the captain thought of that to say, well, okay, so you can fly for 1 hour single engine, so then you can probably fly for 2 hours because there's no definitive rule here. How he reasoned regarding this and the fact that you could continue to fly is impossible to know. All right, it states clearly in the report that they couldn't rule out that he was thinking about the economical impact to the airline when he was deciding to continue to Prague, but they couldn't prove it either. What is true, though, is that if he would have gone in and done some proper fuel calculations, he would have realized that they would have reached Prague without having sufficient fuel to do a diversion to an alternate. Okay? The problem here, of course, is that he did not do this. So in the in the quick reference handbook, in the engine failure shutdown checklist, it says that you are not allowed to use FMC fuel predictions. And the reason for this is that the FMC, who does normally very good fuel predictions, doesn't know that the aircraft is single engine, and doesn't know that the fact of single engine means that the aircraft is now flying a little bit with a crab angle. You know, it has a bit of rudder in, so it's crabbing a bit, and it's also having a dead engine that's not producing any thrust but is producing drag. And because of that, it is burning much more fuel, and obviously also at a lower flight level. Okay, so it says clearly, do not use the FMC for fuel prediction. Instead, you have to go into the performance in-flight chapter in the QRH and see at the altitude and weight you are, what kind of fuel burn you can expect. You can also do a quicker variant of this, which is just going in and checking the fuel flow of the remaining engine, see how long in time you're going to be flying, and then just calculate how much fuel you need, because that's going to be accurate. None of this was done. Instead, he checked the FMC. The FMC said that they're going to land with sufficient fuel, and they continued. He did 3 fuel cross checks on the remainder of the flight, but he didn't do any recalculation of the fuel, nor did he do any kind of just evaluation of the decision to continue to Prague. Right? Nothing. The cabin crew got involved in this case as well. They noticed that something was happening. The captain said in his testimony for the final report that he had told them to do a visual inspection of the engine. The cabin crew was adamant, saying that he did not say that to them, did not tell them to do that. They talked about what kind of PA they needed to do to the passengers, and they decided that they were going to do just a general PA about a technical failure, but that they would continue into Prague. Now, this is not uncommon, it should be said, because when we discuss about what we have to say and not to the passengers, you tend to give them enough to motivate what's happening and to tell them what's going on without giving too much details, because if you do, it's likely that just going to increase the anxiety level in the cabin. So if I say that we have a technical problem with one of our engines, which necessitate us to divert to get engineering attention in Vienna, that's enough detail. But if I go in and I say we've lost one engine, or we have an engine failure on the left-hand side and we are now going to go down to try to get help down in Vienna, that's just going to increase the anxiety level. And it's not something that you want. You just want to make sure that the passengers know what's going on, and that you empower your cabin crew so that they listen to the cabin crew in case there would be some kind of emergency briefing needed. They also decided that there was no need for preparing for an evacuation, which is also completely normal under these circumstances. They made a PA, they continued to fly. There was no more mentioning to ATC about emergency or Mayday until they got into Prague, the Prague ATC area, the TMA, where the crew decided to finally declare a pan-pan in order to get priority in for landing. So it's interesting here that the captain decided to call a pan-pan to get priority into Prague, but did not think about calling pan-pan to get priority into Vienna, which is kind of a little bit going against what he was saying before. They did a normal flaps 15 single engine landing in Prague. They taxied off, and when they got into gate, the engineers were waiting for them because they had told the engineering via ACARS that they had this engine failure. He didn't do any proper tech log entry about the failure. He told the engineers about it. And and this is crucial guys, did not pull the CVR circuit breaker. And the CVR circuit breaker is what stops the cockpit voice recorder from recording. And you have to remember that the cockpit voice recorder only has 2 hours of recording on it. So there are certain things like engine failures, TCAS resolution advisories, or problems with the pressurization, or faulty readbacks and level busts, things like that. That's really serious. That has to, by law, be preserved. Right? The CVR needs to be pulled in order for a subsequent investigation like this to be able to know how the crew was reacting and how they were discussing. He didn't pull this, even though his own manuals that he was a part of writing stated that needed to be done. Okay, so what happened then obviously is that the engineers solved the engine problem, and then the aircraft continued to fly, and the next flight just overwrote whatever was on that tape. So the final report did not have access to the CVR for this data, which is really, really serious. Okay? Right, so this is basically what happened. No one got hurt. There was no injuries. However, the final report that just came out just last week is a stunning rebuke of the performance of the captain. All right. In general terms, normally a final report is only there to state exactly what has happened in a factual term and then give safety recommendations. So it will tell the airline, for example, to do certain things, it will tell the engineering department to do certain things, and it will tell, in some cases, the pilots to do certain things. But in most cases, it only tells the training department of the airline to, okay, make sure your pilots knows about this or increase the training about this. But in this case, they actually went into detailed performance reviews of the involved pilots. So for the first officer, they basically said that he had handled the situation well. He had inputted the right amount of rudder. He tried to tell the captain to initiate descent. He eventually got that to happen. He didn't feel that he didn't feel that the CRM allowed him to speak up more than he actually did. This was a point where they actually did tell the FO that he should have become more assertive. He needs to speak up no matter how high the cockpit gradient is. But apart from that, basically did a good job. Same with the cabin crew, did what they were supposed to. The company itself got some recommendations regarding training of pilots. However, when it came to the pilot in command, and remember that this is the head of operation or the chief pilot, or at least at the time, he was taken away from that position after this incident. Well, they start from the very beginning saying that there were some obvious problems with his headset communication and that were unclear whether or not that had to do with wiring, with the headset, or if it just wasn't any problem with the headset. They couldn't establish that. Then they said the pilot in command did not properly monitor the N1 settings during the takeoff roll, which was mandatory as part of the airport brief that they were flying out of, Samos. Then he also ignored the requests from the first officer to initiate the descent when the engine failure occurred at Flight 360, and he said that that decision, or the fact that he did not communicate well with the first officer, increased the stress level a lot in the cockpit, which could have led to other mistakes during the actual following descent. Then they, as a crew, and him, as being the pilot monitoring specifically, did not call a pan-pan or a mayday call during the descent. And the fact that they then continued to descend without clearance initially endangered the aircraft around them. There was no proper fuel or engine performance calculations done throughout this whole ordeal. They did not, and specifically the captain, did not use the quick reference handbooks, the QRH, in a proper way. He did not read it carefully and didn't follow the advice or the actual mandatory step of plan to land at near suitable airport. The captain did not follow established CRM rules and principles as outlined in the CRM manual that he himself had been a part of writing. They did not kind of have any risk management strategy, threat and error management strategy. And if you guys have seen my video about how to do PIOC, then you know that there is established kind of rules and frameworks for how to do this. That was not followed. They decided to continue to Prague, despite that there were obvious lacks in their fuel calculations, and there was actually doubt about whether or not they would have enough fuel to do such a long flight over 2 hours, single engine. And during this whole flight, there was no more than 3 fuel checks recorded, and no continuing re-evaluation of whether the aircraft was burning more fuel than anticipated, which obviously should have been done. They didn't inform the passengers in a sufficient manner, according to the report. The captain said that he had told the cabin crew to do a visual inspection of the engine. The cabin crew said that he did not do so. And they did not pull the CVR circuit breaker, nor did they put a relevant entry into the technical logbook once the flight was completed. Okay, all of this together was brought to the attention of the captain, and the investigators basically asked him, so what do you think about your performance and the way that this flight was handled? And his response was that he thought that he had sufficient experience and time on the aircraft in order to evaluate all associated risks that the aircraft could get itself into. And in this case, the safety of the flight or safety of any other flights around it was never compromised. That was essentially what he said. And because the investigators had showed all of this data to him and he responded in that way, they basically ordered a psychological evaluation of the captain, saying that, we have to check if this person actually is sane. Right? And I've never in my life, I've been reading a lot of final reports in my life, never seen that happening. It's never seen such a complete rebuke of the performance of one single crew member in one incident. So basically they're saying that this was not done well. There was several things lacking. Most of the problems emanated from the incompetence of the captain in this case. And because of the way that this is written, there's now a criminal investigation against the captain. I don't know how far that has become. I don't know if he has been removed from flying. I know that he lost his chief pilot or head of operation position after this incident, but he was allowed to continue in the role of both a captain and a type rating instructor, and I think as an examiner as well. I don't know if that's been changed when this final report came out, but it is a stunning read. I'm going to actually link to the English translation that my Patreons once again did below this video. It's really interesting to read, and there's a lot to be learned here, guys. Basically, it shows that there are still these type of pilots around who do believe that they're God's gift to aviation, that no matter what the manual says, no matter what the rule says, what CRM says, they think that they know better. And we have to, these pilots just needs to be weeded out. They have nothing to do in a modern cockpit. This is not a safe way to handle an incident like this. There are established ways that it should be done, and that's the way to do it. Guys, this was just one out of thousands of incidents, accidents that have been out there. I would love to hear what you want me to talk about. If there's more emphasis you want me to do on certain things, for example, tell me in the comments to this video what incidents and accidents or occurrences it is that you want me to talk about. Now, I will be limiting myself to incidents that has been concluded, so where there's been a final report released. So that's worth thinking about. But do tell me, and also make sure that you have signed up to mentorpilot.com. You can come in and you can become a member at different levels. So if you become a cadet member, it's completely free of charge, but you will be given perks. There's going to be, for example, you'll be able to access my Discord server where me and my Patreons are doing a lot of discussing. Now, if you are on the cadet level, you'll reach up to a certain kind of standing in the Discord server. My paying members in mentorpilot.com and my Patreons are at a slightly higher level, but I want to create this community together with the Mentor Aviation app to make sure that you have a place where you can put your flying pictures in, your merch pictures, where you can ask questions and talk about aviation and just have this fantastic aviation kind of community going. So go to mentorpilot.com, register yourself, get yourself into the Discord server, start talking to me, or do the same inside of the Mentor Aviation app. Doesn't matter. I just want to be able to discuss with you and let you be part of this community. Have an absolutely fantastic day wherever you are, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye. Right, guys, I really hope that you liked that. If you want more content like that, more aviation content, well then, check this out. I hope that you have subscribed to the channel and that you've highlighted the little notification bell. See you inside of the Mentor Aviation app and have an absolutely fantastic day. Bye-bye.